everyone. My name is Rebecca Parsons, and I am one of the recurring co-hosts of the Thoughtworks Technology Podcast series, and I'm joined by my colleague, Prem.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Rebecca. Glad to be here. I'm also one of the regular co-hosts and looking forward to a wonderful episode as usual.
And I'm joined by two other colleagues from Thoughtworks, Sophia Tanya. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm Sophia Tanya, but I go by Tanya. I'm a tech principal at Thoughtworks. Have been at Thoughtworks for about 10 years now, and I'm also part of the Digital Scale Up group, which is kind of relevant to the topic at hand we are going to talk about soon.
And Stefania.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Stefania Stevensdottir. I'm also a technical principal at Thoughtworks, and I've worked here for about 10 years, and I work as a general architect and technical principal for Thoughtworks clients in the East market and in North America.
Okay. So Tanya, you mentioned the Digital Scale-Up Studio. So why don't one of the two of you tell me a little bit about what this unit does and why it's different?
Yeah. So through the many years of Thoughtworks history, we've actually, even before the Scale-Up group has been created as an independent unit, we have been partnering with startups and scale-ups to help them grow and reach their next milestones. And a few years ago, we started thinking, well, we should probably sort of formalize or codify the lessons that we are seeing, the patterns that we are seeing into something a bit more coherent to partner with these sort of organizations better. And so the group was created, and part of what we aim to do as a group is also to share the lessons that we've learned, as I guess I kind of alluded to before. And that led us to publishing a series about bottlenecks that we are seeing in scale-ups, which one of them is the one that Stefania and I wrote about cost efficiency.
Okay, so why don't you introduce this cost efficiency topic to me? And Stefania, I'll start with you. Why is this something that was interesting enough for you to, invest the effort into writing an article and now doing this podcast?
I have kind of maybe a little bit of a different background from a lot of technical principles, but I actually also used to study something called financial engineering and something called operations research, which interestingly enough, both focus on cost and finances. And the other side of it actually are on optimization and operational efficiency. But I end up working in software engineering and architecture. And I end up working with a client of ours here in North America, and we're on the beginning of their kind of digital journey, and we had worked with them from scratch. We had built their holistic platform, and as they were growing very fast, we started seeing like the costs starting to build up faster than we anticipated, because we got a spurt of growth. And all of a sudden, the cost started growing, and that kind of wasn't an expected growth nor expected cost. And then all of a sudden, we had to start thinking a little differently about how do we operate these platforms and how do we make cost associated with our holistic thinking, both from architecture perspective, operational perspective, and just in a forecasting expectation for the client. And this kind of led us to an initiative where we started looking into these operational cost efficiencies, which I thought were really intriguing. And we had a lot of good learned lessons that we thought were applicable to other clients, and actually also to scale-ups in particular.
And Tanya, what about this topic is interesting to you?
For me, it was kind of a convergence of a few things. The first one is, as a tech principal of one of our accounts before, I kind of got sucked into a cost savings engagement because the client that I was working with had their cost ballooned, and we had to spin up a team to look into it, to resolve both the technical, how do we reduce costs right away and how do we maintain it going forward. So that, of course, made me think about the topic. And then the other factor that was converging at around the same time is I was starting to get pretty involved in the Scale Up group that I mentioned earlier. And of course, the scale up group was thinking about these bottlenecks, these things that are starting to, the patterns that we are seeing, they are typically starting to constrain startups' growth at a certain point, and cost was one of them. So those two things came together, and then I also wanted to both share what I've learned and also learn more about the topic from the other authors.
And so, we very often hear that in the early stages of a startup, what you're really trying to do is just figure out what it is the market wants. And cost is certainly less of a factor there. So what are the signs that you've reached the point where cost becomes this more significant factor? Because clearly you don't want to cost optimize too soon when you're trying to explore and figure out fits. So, how do you start to recognize, we're really getting into trouble here now, and we've got to take this forward? What are those signs?
There are multiple ones that we can see, but one big one is actually kind of just visibility. Is the first one, the meaning that if the person who is mainly handling the invoice is the first one who starts saying something, or the forecasting becomes really nowhere close to where the actuals are, that is often the first kind of bell that starts ringing, because there's actual a person who manages it that it gets kind of concerned and worried. And that's kind of the first alert of it. But there are other more subtle signs that you can see. For example, that kind of the cost starts growing faster per unit of change, meaning either customer that uses your platform or what you're selling. And you are seeing that the cost keeps increasing more per this individual unit. But then there's other signs that you can kind of see, that your contracts that you're expecting, for example, of third-party services, maybe your observability tools or your cloud costs, you had certain kind of expectation of how the cost would go through on the month, but it completely changes from an engineering perspective. You might have the visibility, but the changes are really fast. Those are kind of times that you start looking into it a bit more. It's normally something starts ringing internally that you feel like, hey, we really need to start looking into this. But also another aspect of it is that when you go through funding rounds in the scale-up culture, you might need to be showing that your the cost of goods sold is actually good. And then also is a time when people start actually looking really deeply into this, because it can affect how you're getting, what kind of funding you're getting.
So I do have a question for you, because maybe a lot of listeners do have this as well. So are we saying that it's not necessary to be cost conscious right from the outset?
No, you don't need to. There are different kinds of phases when you're especially coming from a startup, a thought process. Then in the beginning, you're just being scrappy. You don't have that much money, and then you're trying to find a product market fit. And you're going to just try to figure out how to get to where you need to do with that financial runway you have. That is different kind of cost consideration, right? If you don't have a lot of it, you're kind of be using it to a maximum advantage, but you're trying to do it to actually reach a certain kind of conclusion in a time frame that you have. That's not when you should be thinking about tagging your resources and things like that. You might do it just because you don't want to waste a penny because of where you are in your phase. But it is not something you should necessarily need to think about from an operational efficiency for a long term. It's not where your effort should be put in. You should be focusing on the product market fit. That is not necessarily a phase that you should be looking at it. And then when you kind of get into hey, I found some product market fit and I'm growing, you're still trying to capture customers. So you're not necessarily trying to focus on this cost efficiency even at that point in time. It is actually only when you start moving a little bit further up when you kind of have to start, hey, now we've reached a certain amount of maturity and I want to continue growing. That's kind of where your slopes start to get kind of, you see it kind of happen, and you want to be like, hey, now we need to start thinking more about operational efficiencies. And this actually starts applying to more than just this bottleneck cost. Like we can see this also happening in technical debt at a similar point of point in that growth curve.
So what you seem to be saying is, it might not matter until you hit a sort of a cusp of popularity.
It's not that it doesn't matter at all. Obviously, if you're really bleeding money from your architecture, it is going to affect your runway. But realistically, when you are very early, the chances of that happening is much lower compared to when you have started hitting product market fit and you are scaling in terms of the number of customers that you have to serve. Typically, the risk of cost ballooning is larger when you are at that stage, and that is where it can materially impact your runway. So again, I think cost matters in all phases, but in the earlier phases, it's not a top priority. It's maybe something that you're just watching on the sidelines to make sure that it's not going, going crazy in terms of the numbers. But your priority for the first few stages are just getting that product market fit. And when you've gotten it, then cost becomes a bigger potential risk to your company.
And we're thinking about this from two different terms, right? There's a cost in terms of cost of people and investment in your product. And then there's the operational cost of running your product. And I think we should make that distinction here, because that's kind of why we're saying that you think about cost all the time. But like we said in the beginning, it's more around, the investment I'm putting into this company, am I getting enough out of it to be able to reach some kind of popularity to make my company work? It is not necessarily tied to what we kind of focus more on in the article, which is operational costs more than anything. Like, how am I running this product and moving that forward? And that's kind of the different distinction that we are making in this article. And we don't really focus on things like labor costs or marketing costs or anything like that. We focus more on just infrastructure, operational cost, and ties to technology.
Yeah. So sort of the cost of your architecture, the architecture that you're using to serve your customers. That's what our focus is for the article.
And let's briefly look at this from the other end of the spectrum. Before we get into the specifics of the recommendations, how is this different, or is there a difference in thinking about this operational efficiency for a scale up versus, an established organization? Is your approach to operational efficiency going to be different because you're a scale up as opposed to, some Fortune 100 company?
So certainly Fortune 100 companies can also get into a situation where cost balloon in some part of the organization. I think we do see that typically these bigger companies tend to have more rigor around cost controls. But that's not always the case, or not always uniform across different parts of the organization or different technology workloads. So for example, one of these organizations can be maybe a little less mature in terms of how they control costs for data workloads because they are still building that capability. But again, the problem can occur. The approach, I think, the higher level approach that we cover in the article, the reduce and sustain, a lot of those apply to both. The main difference that I see is, apart from that tendency that Fortune 100 companies tend to have a little more control already, is the effect on the sustainability of the company is very different. Because scale-ups have more limited funding. They're still very dependent on investor funding typically, whereas Fortune 100 companies, they are a little bit more, they have more cushion, so to say, financially. And so the impact of the ballooning costs can be a bit more manageable.
Yeah, but there's also another aspect of it. It's then when the approaches are kind of similar, but when it comes to the Fortune 100 companies or bigger enterprises, one aspect of it is that you have more players that you have to kind of coordinate between. We often talk about in our approach, like, hey, you should look at it from different aspects of like these FinOps teams or these financial operations teams. They come from different parts of the organization. In a scale up, you might not have that many employees. Maybe you're 100 people. Everybody knows each other by name. You can kind of work across barriers or walls. But when you become part of this, into those bigger companies, it is often multiple kind of walls between different departments or people who never really necessarily work together that closely, that need to come together to actually make this work. You would maybe have vendor management groups that have to deal with your contracts and third-party managed services. But at the same time, the technology people also need to have that relationship because they actually help them manage the solutions, right? They give them their recommendations. And they also, in that collaboration has to be a lot tighter than maybe normally it is. Or for example, you start to work with your finance department a lot more closely because maybe how you guys were structuring your budgets doesn't make sense for with the new cloud ecosystem versus how it worked when you were on-prem. And there is a different kind of ways of handling your bookkeeping. There are things that all of a sudden in enterprise, big enterprises that have a lot more legacy, that there's just more, basically more things around it. And it's a little bit more lift to kind of move everybody in the same direction. The good thing about it is that you have a lot of people with different kind of specialization, but it's just about getting this group of people who normally never talk to each other together to come towards a goal. And that often is kind of can be maybe a little bit more of a difficult sale. While in the scale-ups groups, because everybody's so tight, you can just kind of move these things forward maybe a little faster. But again, you have more cushion on that price than necessarily in the scale-up group. So it kind of balances us out, but it does change it a little bit.
Right. I do have a related question there in terms of the recommendations that you make in your article or the signs that you point out, right? So are those more universally applicable for, I know you've directed it specifically or addressed it specifically to scale-ups, but can this be applied a bit more universally to larger organizations as well?
Yes, it can. Most of them can, yeah.
Yeah, I would say yes. I was going to, think of a longer answer than just yes. So basically the approach that we propose in the article, right, are two. First is, this is assuming that the company, whether I guess a Fortune 100 or a big enterprise in the States, are already seeing that their costs in maybe one part of the organization has increased dramatically, beyond their projection or beyond their budget or something like that. The first approach that we propose is basically reducing that cost. No brainer. Of course, everybody will be like, okay, of course you have to reduce that. And how do we reduce that? It's really, I think it's a pretty general framework that can definitely be applied in all types of companies. And it's really, okay, let's look at that part of the organization where cost is increasing dramatically. Let's look at what part of the cost is ballooning. Let's look at the drivers for that cost. And what I mean by driver is sometimes it's specific applications, or it's a specific managed service, or it's certain environments, right? You can sort of, when you tease apart the cost reports that you have, you can sort of see, okay, which factors are playing into the cost more. And then once we do that, we have two levers, right, to control that cost. And I think this is, again, something that definitely applies to all types of organizations. Of course, the exact lever will depend on the drivers, like whether it be, let's say your observability service, like a managed service for observability, is ballooning. What are the levers? What are the cost factors for that, right? And then from there, we just sort of prioritize, which ones are the low-hanging fruits versus, so basically we prioritize across effort and impact, right? And we just start executing in collaboration with teams that are sort of the product teams that actually work on those areas. But that said, we also made a comment in the article that often, because we need to move fast to reduce costs at this point, and that sort of point, right? You need a team that is focused on that initiative to just reduce costs in collaboration, of course, with the different teams. So this is what we're proposing in the reduce approach, and I think that definitely applies to the others. Sustain, maybe we'll talk about this later, is completely different in approach, because it's all about the sort of the cultural change that you need to sort of infuse to the organization to make sure that cost stays at that level, at that lower level or more sustainable level. And I think, again, that the larger points there still apply to both scale-ups and enterprises.
So tell me a little bit more about this sustain phase, because, when we talk about things, for example, like technical debt, one of the questions I very often get asked is, okay, I'm going to give you X period of time and X amount of resources to fix this problem. How do I know that you're not going to be back in 6 or 12 months asking me to do it again? And I think, I suspect that's a lot of what the sustain phase is about. So how do you go about making sure that you don't get yourself back to the same kind of problem? What are some of the strategies that scale-ups can use during the sustain phase?
Yeah, maybe before we're getting to that, just to paint a bit of a story. Let's say there's a scale-up or a company that has gotten into a bit of a mess in terms of their architectural costs. Let's say it's because initially, and this is pretty common too in startups, scale-ups, it's a bit of a free-for-all, especially, let's say, in pre-production environments. Free-for-all as in anybody can create any infrastructure, right? And let's say that they are also doing that because they are not very well aware of the cost impact that the things that they are creating in those pre-production environments are costing the company. Of course, I think a lot of people have intuition that, of course, if we create an infrastructure component on some cloud provider and we don't turn it off, for example, when they're not used, of course, it'll cost something, that we don't have such strong intuition to the level of numbers for those. So let's say it's something like that. In that situation, after we reduce the cost, reducing the cost can be as simple as turning off things, right? Of course, we cover more of the strategies for reduce in the article. But let's say in that situation, we just reduce by turning off things. If that's all we do, and we don't fix, for example, that sort of empowering the engineers and the product teams with, hey, here is how your actions are impacting costs for your product team or for your part of the company, then they're going to operate without sort of that signal in mind, right? So that is even with this sort of contrived scenario, that's sort of the thinking behind the sustain phase, is that once we reduce the cost, there are certain things that we need to change in the company in terms of, again, the culture and the operating model to make sure that people are operating now with sort of more cost control naturally. So without really policing their every action, we want some cost awareness to be embedded in their mindset. So maybe I'll let Stefania cover the sustain phase.
When we think about some of these sustain phases, it is different aspects that you have to kind of consider. But the main one that we see often lacking in a lot of companies, both scale-ups and enterprises, is actually the visibility of cost in a way that makes sense to people, either tied to product or tied to teams. There's no way for them to see, like, hey, did my cost actually increase with these new product changes that we put in place? Or did our revenue increase and our cost increased more than we expected? And a lot of that is missing from the view of engineers or architects, so they can't really understand the impact that decisions they were making. That is one big thing that we think can really help with just changing a little bit organizational thinking and consideration around cost. But there's, of course, side effects to some of that. Like, we don't want people to become frugal to a fault. This has to happen with our good product management and leadership, because we don't want people to be pinching pennies on the cost of necessarily product evolution, but we want them to think about this because actually technical decision can impact cost immensely. There's other aspect of it as well that we also see often lacking, which is kind of tied to platform engineering, meaning like thinking about how to make it easy for people to do the right thing and difficult to do the wrong thing. So thinking about, for example, tagging infrastructure in a way that makes sense. Can you limit how people can tag their infrastructure so it is tied to what makes sense to you? So as a team, if I create infrastructure through my pipelines, is it like, do I have only specific values that I can choose from so it makes sense from a perspective of the visibility of the cost? Or it could be as simple as like, have you considered cost when you're coming up with solutions? Some people have architectural decision records that they make decision. Is there a question in the ADR that says it was cost considerations like thought about, or is that an impact tied to the solution? Like, it is sometimes really simple nudges that are needed to kind of change how we think about cost as an organization. Those are kind of the main ones that we can see from a organizational culture perspective, from a sustain phase. But then there's another aspect of it, which is actually partnership with people that you work with from a third-party vendor perspective, managed solutions. Almost all managed services provider, most of your tools, your cloud infrastructure, have account managers that help you. And having those relationships and actually building those actually can help you be more sustainable when it comes to cost. It's their job to kind of help you navigate their contract structure and figure out how to deal with the scale as you move forward. And having that relationship really helps you understand the product you're using and how that can affect your overall cost and forecasting. And I think a lot of people kind of forget about that. They're like, I've built the contract, I have a tool, I don't need to talk to the people again. Which is not the right way of thinking about it. You want to actually have a pretty close relationship. If you're not meeting with your account manager probably at least once every couple of months, you're maybe missing out on opportunities. And we actually cover that in our articles. There are things that you can ask for, or especially if you are okay with like advertising, you're using a tool, you might be getting discounts. There are things that you can do to make that relationship more beneficial in the future, because you want to kind of be able to be cost efficient with the tools that you actually use.
One of the things too that occurs to me is if you focus too much on cost, and this is what one of you mentioned earlier, if you go into too much of a frugality mindset, you might compromise your product strategy or something like that. But do you have ideas or strategies for how you find that balance? You can't completely minimize the cost because, again, you might be doing the wrong thing by your customers and your product, but you also want to be operationally effective. So can you talk to me a little bit about how we find that sweet spot of, okay, we're not spending too much, but we're actually spending enough?
There's one aspect of thinking about it. We think about something called unit cost sometimes, and there's thinking about, like we had talked about this, like either it's kind of unit or cost. It could be a person, your customer who uses your digital product, or it could be the operational cost tied to supporting a physical product, or it could even be actually requests going into your system. That could be the cost of unit. And you can actually look at the cost per unit, and you want to actually think about that cost is that it can be good for you based on your business, right? And that's kind of collaboration with your business stakeholders or your product managers and saying, like, we have that cost. If you're adding more product capability or we're charging more for the product, increasing that cost is fine. It's actually, you're thinking about that margin. But for example, if you're not either increasing your revenue, either being the number of people or with the cost, and you are still increasing continuously on that unit cost, you need to start looking into it, right? Because that means that you're taking away money that you can use in the future for your product evolution. And I think often looking at that cost structure often helps you make certain amount of those kind of decisions. And so you have to think about all this kind of holistically. But that actually becomes really difficult when you're looking at kind of company level capabilities. So think about when you're making decisions about tools that you're going to be contracting with that are going to be used across the company, right? You might have multiple product teams and they're all using that tool. There might be usages that actually affect how much each one of these teams are having cost, but everybody's using it and you have to have a contract structure associated with it. But you're making this decision. And then the question becomes, are you going to go for the cheapest solution? Or are you going to go for the solution that's best for you? And you have to make those kind of compromises, just like anything in architecture, right? There's always pros and cons to everything. But you have to kind of think about it holistically. And that's actually when your partners become really useful. You have to think about your forecast of your company, especially you're using third-party tools that affect how you use it. You're looking at the forecasting, you're looking at the capabilities and your growth. Where do you see yourself going in the next year, 2 years, 3 years? Does this tool seem to match what I am moving towards? But then you have to think, I'm making this investment. There might be either a contract investment or a money investment. And then you have to think about the usage. What does it help you? What will it do for you? And then you have to make that return on investment calculation. And that's when that team mentality becomes super important. You need to bring in your finance people. You need to bring in your product people to think about where are we going? And then you have to think about the architectural mindset of what is this tool or what is this managed services doing for me? What does it actually provide me? And what is the kind of actual monetary value versus what is value that is going to bring us future growth? And then you have to do all those calculations. This is not a simple calculation by any means. And that's why you have this group of people all working together to do these things together. But those becomes really important. And so thinking about ROI analysis is actually really like a group sport, because you don't want to get stuck on one frugal mindset. Everybody has to think about it together with those kind of different dimensions that are coming together.
So Tanya, earlier you mentioned that a lot of this is a cultural change in the developers. If you just, they created too many environments, so we're going to shut down the extra environments. Well, if you don't change their mindset, they're just going to recreate the environments because they didn't create them just because they could. What is the strategy for getting people who are primarily software developers? My job is to, get this product, this feature out as quickly as possible. What's the strategy for helping them understand this cultural awareness of growth at any cost is not where we're going? How do we make these individuals aware of these issues and their responsibility in helping to control this?
Yeah, I think of it in a few dimensions, I guess. One side is that visibility that Stefanie talked about, like giving teams visibility. That's a part of it. And then not just visibility, but some level of accountability for teams. But there's some nuance here, because when I say accountability, we talked about not wanting teams to go to the extreme and be so frugal that that's all they focus on either. So the way I think of that is either via processes. So for example, keeping a cadence of some kind of review with the engineering manager of the team, just making sure that cost isn't going in the wrong direction dramatically. Or another way to think about it, to complement the process, is to think about cost as sort of a guardrail metric. And what I mean by that is a lot of teams are given metrics for their to measure how successful they are, right, in what they do. Cost can be part of that, but it should not be the top metric unless the company is really, really focused right now on that reduced phase, on just reducing cost, right? But if we are in the sustained phase, then I think cost can be there, should be there, but not as a top one. It's just like a guardrail. We should not go beyond this. And also, when I say we should not go beyond this, there is that devil's in the detail. Because if you're saying overall cost cannot go beyond this, then that's tricky, because sometimes the overall sort of architecture cost for a product, if if it's serving many more customers than it did before, of course, cost is going to go up. And that's why Stefania brought up unit cost, right? And we can be very, very granular and very, very detailed in the way we measure unit cost, but we can start from something simpler. We can divide that overall cost for a team over number of transactions or number of customers, right? A crude sort of back of the napkin calculation is a start. So that's one way I think about it. The other way that I think about it is I also don't want cost to be necessarily mentioned in like every single stand-up, or every single meeting that the team has. I think a big part of making the sustain successful is just embedding good practices that we expect people to follow as part of just the sensible defaults. So basically making it easy for people to do the right thing. And a way to do this, I think we have a few examples. A way to do this is if we expect people to tag their resources, then let's make it easy for people to tag their resources. If we expect people to let's say use spot instances for workloads that are ephemeral and then okay to disrupt in the middle, then let's make it easy for them to do that. So I think those are the two sides. One is a level of accountability, and another one is let's just make it easy also for the engineers and the teams.
It also sounds like there are, again, similarities with things like technical debt and code quality, is that, there is no absolute number. It cannot get over 42. But trends are important, and you want to understand, why something is trending a particular way. And even unit cost can trend upward if you're adding new features and new capabilities, et cetera. But then it's still, okay, here's the trend. Is this increase what I expected it to be as a result of the functionality? So great. Where do you go next with this? Or is there a next? I mean, or is it just more and more sophistication around making the right thing, the easy thing to do? Or how do we actually find that magic spot between, cost and ability to deliver? I mean, where do you think of taking this work?
I think for a lot of our clients, it's actually also tied to thinking about it from a platform perspective. Like for me, the tying together cost efficiency and operational efficiency to kind of platform thinking, which Thoughtworks in general is really a big fan of, right? How to make things easy for people to do, and that is the right thing to do. I kind of adding kind of the cost dimension to all of it actually makes it more appealing to a lot of our clients, right? Because it shows more tangible results when you actually have other aspects or other dimensions tied to cost visibility and how you can track things. So from, at least from my perspective, from my day-to-day, it kind of just impacts how I talk about architecture and infrastructure on day-to-day basis with this kind of cost dimension tied to it. And when you're talking to people who also care about that, actually resonates a lot better with them. Talking sometimes about ephemeral infrastructure doesn't necessarily resonate, but when you say like, hey, here's the cost implications of using it, or like how much money you can save, like it becomes a different kind of conversation. Even as kind of from some technologists' perspective, it doesn't seem as fun, but for me, it actually shows more value tied to it. And that kind of was at least what I bring to it on day-to-day perspective.
Yeah, I guess for me, so I'm part of the Scale Up group, and we are actually, since we wrote the article, we've used some of these lessons learned and the framework that we are thinking to help some clients. So I think we'll continue to do that and to learn more from further execution of this framework in the wild. And then from a personal perspective, what else to do with this work? That's something for me to think about. But for people who are interested in the other articles that we have in the bottleneck series. So again, the patterns that we are seeing that are constraining or impeding growth in scale-ups, I would definitely recommend checking out the series in Martin Fowler's blog. We've had, I think, 5 articles come out. Ours is the 4th one. And it covers a bunch of topics already. Right now, it covers the tech debt, bottleneck, as Rebecca Yusuf pointed out. It covers talent, friction between product and engineering, this one on cost, and it covers resilience as well. And we're working on upcoming ones as well.
Great. Well, Tanya, Stefania, thank you for that. It's always great to see people who can be passionate about something like operational effectiveness and efficiency. So thank you all for your observations, and thank you, Prem, for joining me on this edition of the Thoughtworks Technology Podcast. Thanks to our listeners.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.